Aeneg by Cáel Louw. Chapter 10. Dylan ran after the scout. He always would, even in situations like this when he knew he really shouldn't. Cáel was angry, and it was never advised to be anywhere within earshot of the man, let alone deliberately put oneself within sightlines. And yet something was just so off. Cáel! He called out to the man, who was jabbing at the elevator button so hard the tech wondered if he was going to be rewiring it in the near future. Cáel, talk to me. The delay for the doors to open allowed the younger man to catch up, but he had to turn sideways to miss being caught by them as they closed. Cáel refused to look at him while the metal box ascended. He seemed to have cleaned himself up a little, but he was still pretty filthy, and his fists were shaking, nearly imperceptibly. So, Dylan began. It was always like this when the scout was mad. Maybe it wouldn't be so different. Dylan couldn't simply order him to spill his guts like Damien could. The tech had to take a different approach, and, after nearly 6 years, he'd more or less got it down to a fine art. Ndi was pretty angry, he commented as they passed by the farm. What did you do? None of your business, the man spat past clenched teeth. After a beat, Dylan followed up with, Do you want to talk about it? Cáel shook his head hard again. No. Cáel viscerally flinched when the light of the field shone in through the side panels. I know she's right, the man muttered on a whisper. That was not what Dylan had been expecting. Usually there was a lot more effort on Cáel's part to get him to drop the topic. Who? He asked, regardless that he was pretty certain he knew who his friend was talking about. Ndidia Mako Basi. Cáel spat the name out like it was something vile. What did she say? Dylan asked as gently as he could, past the lump forming in his throat. That I won't have a place here for much longer. Cáel looked 10 years younger when he finally managed to look at the tech. When this is all over, will you help her exile me? Dylan took his time to consider his answer. What Cáel was asking was probably not what he wanted to say. She didn't mean it, the tech finally decided on. She's only been here a few months. She doesn't know you like I do. That's not what I asked, the scout returned, his tone slipping deeper and his words slow. Dylan's breath hitched audibly. Something was definitely not right. No, Cáel, I wouldn't help her exile you. But you wouldn't stop her either, the man murmured, like it was a hard fact. His entire stance shifted to turn towards Dylan, and the tech suddenly felt that the elevator was entirely too small a space for this conversation, as Cáel hissed accusingly. You like her. Oh. It was a physical effort for Dylan to hold in a sigh. It really shouldn't have surprised him how insecure Cáel could be at times. He looked up to find those green eyes on him, already suspecting the tech's answer. Too bad he was right about the second part. We speak the same language, Dylan answered. She has a fascinating mind and we work well together. So you're trading me in for that bitch! His voice raised exponentially as he spoke, so loudly Dylan entirely missed the static of the intercom, crackling to life with a message from engineering. The tech was too dumbfounded to hear it. Cáel, I'm allowed to have other friends, Dylan scolded, pushing off from the wall. What the hell is wrong with you today? Why are you reacting like this? What's wrong with me? Cáel all but screamed. Oh no. The scout was too fast, and he punched Dylan so hard that Tech would have slammed into the elevator doors if they hadn't already opened. Instead, he fell into the vacant tower. Dylan barely noticed the absence of the bodies past the throbbing pain in his face. His eyes watered, and one was swelling against the cool glass floor. Everything went dark as the power diverted to the lower levels. You think I'm weak, that I don't have a heart to hurt? Cáel yelled after him, but the words were muffled until a calloused hand threaded into Dylan's hair, and pain blossomed, shoving the world into overly bright contrast, even though his eyes were squeezed shut. Dylan screamed as he was hefted off the floor by the roots and physically thrown across the room. He hit a screen so hard it shattered and collapsed, even as the force carried him further to slam into a second one. Glass bit into his arms and sides, and wires hissed around him where he fell. He felt something wet on his face, but he couldn't focus enough to figure out if he was crying or bleeding. A hard boot landed in his stomach, and he couldn't scream anymore. He couldn't even breathe anymore, as his entire body went into spasms. "You'd relish her cutting me up to find out, wouldn't you?" Dylan was completely lost. It didn't even sound like Cáel. His jersey dug into his neck and under his arms as he was hurled off the floor and thrown into something hard. It must have been a wall, but all he knew was that it had winded him enough to leave him gasping and choking as his lungs silently screamed. He couldn't catch a single breath before calloused fingers closed around his neck and cut off his air supply entirely. He vaguely heard a strangled whine, but with the edges of his vision turning dull and the sound of his own blood pounding in his ears, he could have been wrong. He kicked out, and his fingers became wet as he clawed at the hand keeping oxygen from his lungs, but it did nothing to help. His eyes rolled back in his head, and just before he thought he was going to pass out, it all stopped. His knees hit the floor, and his body heaved in lungful after lungful of air. His core spasmed, coughing hurt more in his gut than in his throat, and the haze slowly crept out again. Everything glowed amber in the blocked-off room, and Cáel just stood before him. The scout looked as shocked by his actions as Dylan felt. The man's mouth moved, but nothing came out, and his eyes couldn't stop jumping from the tech to his own hands and back again. His bracer was humming and the blade was out. Fresh red splattered his fists, and this time, it didn't belong to a monster. I'm sorry," he murmured, indecisive about whether or not to help or leave. Dylan tried to stand, but gave up quickly when his ribs protested hard. Cáel was at his side instantly. He felt awful. He tried to wipe the blood off of Dylan's face, but only succeeded in spreading it around. The tech looked terrified, and he had every right to be. That fear, that was his fault. Cáel drew his hands back and away from the trembling figure. "I'm going out." His voice didn't sound like his own. "Don't," Dylan managed to choke out. He made a grab for the scout's hand and tried for a smile once he felt the calloused fingers beneath his own. "Stay with me," he wheezed pathetically. "We'll fix it." Everything hurt so much. It's dangerous to guard this late. He had to keep Cáel with him, or he'd probably do something really stupid. "Good. Maybe I'll die and you'll finally be rid of me." Cáel sounded hollow. He was clearly shutting down. "It's not what Dylan began, but Cáel's free hand cupped the side of his face and slammed his head against the wall before he could finish. Everything went black. Chapter 11. Trix had quickly staved out of the way when the boys had stormed and rushed from the lab. She couldn't have been offended that Dylan had forgotten about her while Cáel and the newbie hadn't even noticed her presence, but if she were honest, it didn't really bother her. It had given her time to watch as Oh hell, as the new girl crawled around on the floor after her fallen head. She seemingly panicked about something, and had spun around screaming, "No, don't," though had jumped in fright at the sight of the woman standing there. Trix could understand why Cáel was attracted to her. She was cute, with her bare feet and makeshift lab coat. The girl had had to roll up the sleeves. No doubt it hadn't even belonged to the person who'd used it before her. Big doe eyes and a pretty face. If she didn't, ever so slightly, want to punch the girl, Trix may have actually taken a different kind of swing at her too. "Oh my frickin'!" Dee gasped, bent over and clutching at her chest. "Warner girl, you're creeping around?" She breathed deeply, a few times to calm her shocked nerves. "It wouldn't be creeping then, would it?" Trix chuckled, and pushed off her perch against the wall. She'd never liked this place. Too close to the maze for her liking. "Right," the girl responded hesitantly. "Anyway, If you're looking for Marcus, he's not here today. I could tell him you stopped by. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Trix, the woman smiled sweetly. And don't worry about it. I came to speak to you, Ndee? She let her eyes wander to the creature, with its chest pulled open in the center of the room. Is that the thing Cáel and Thrisha brought back? She asked, with equal parts awe and disgust, walking right up to it and marveled at the sheer size of it. Yes, Ndee answered softly. I've almost finished with it, but... I am so turned on right now. Excuse me? Ndee stopped dead, and Trix chuckled at the realization that she had spoken out loud. 3. Oh well, nothing she could do to take it back. 2. 1. Everything went dark. What the hell? Ndee squeaked, frozen in place. They're just making a new Cebus cell, Trix chuckled. If you give it a minute, the lights will come back on. I don't understand. The girl sounded scared. How quaint. It takes a lot of energy to create a Cebus cell. Like 80% of the city's power is diverted to the engineering level. Look. A soft glow slowly illuminated the lab from the level below. Gently but quickly, it got brighter and brighter as the cell solidified. Ndee watched through the floor, transfixed, as people she hadn't bothered to notice moved around just beneath her. It made some vague sense, as her hindbrain reminded her how light and reflections worked, though it was of little importance, as the amber glow turned red before fading back down. The usual hum of energy returned, along with the lights that hid the lower level, though Ndee could now point out soft red and amber glows from certain areas down there. It's amazing, she breathed, and Trix scoffed. What's amazing is that Cáel killed this thing. The woman's gaze wandered over to the carcass. Alone. I like a man who can wreak havoc, she murmured. An image of the scarred scout flashed before her mind's eye, covered in blood and grinning like a loon. She'd almost forgot what it was like to see him like that. You like him too, don't you? She asked Ndee, lifting her eyes to pin the girl under a heavy, knowing gaze, and slunk around the table slowly. You two do spend a lot of time together. Ndee seemed confused for all of 10 seconds, before her face warped into something defensive, and Trix had to chuckle to herself, because she just knew the girl was going to get it wrong. Listen, Ndee began slowly, if a bit breathily. He's the one who always comes looking for me. He annoys me. I insult him, and he usually leaves. If you're his girlfriend or something, I don't... Trix had to laugh at that, and the sound cut off whatever else the little girl had left to say. Oh no, sweetie, she chuckled. We just sleep together. Ndee didn't seem all that impressed. And why are you telling me this? Because I've seen the way he looks at you, and the way you look at him. He fascinates you, even more so than those Cebus cells or this Memph evolution. I can tell. From one woman to another, I thought I should give you a heads up. That really isn't necessary, Ndee began, but Trix continued like she hadn't heard her. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't go for it, she grinned. The experience is well worth it. Just be careful around him. He's crazy as catnip, fights like a devil, screws like a jackhammer, and sleeps like a puppy. She giggled at the utterly appalled look she got in response. By now, she had come to stand directly in front of the girl, and looked down at her to whisper conspiratorially, He likes you, even if he won't admit it yet. But I see the signs. That's gross, Ndee stammered. He's like 20-something. You're almost there yourself, darling. The woman winked at her, and the girl physically recoiled. Maybe envy wasn't quite right, but it suited her in this moment to think so. Underneath the catnip crazy and the violent streak temper, Cáel's sex is actually fragile, she sighed offhandedly, slipping right up into the girl's personal space and looking her dead in the eye. Why are you telling me this? Ndee shot back at her, the little thing finally growing a spine. That certainly wouldn't do. This is a warning to be careful with him, Trix said sweetly, even as she slowly curled a finger around a lock of the girl's pitch hair. Don't think you can step to me like you do to him. He finds it endearing. I won't be so playful in return. The girl's eyes went wide and she shrunk back, but there was nowhere for her to go, as her back bumped into the wall. You've been asking questions, Ndi, the woman hummed, tone sickly sweet, and people have been watching. As a friend, I'm doing you the courtesy of letting you know that not everyone in the city hates our resident little psychopath. He keeps that hard ass at the top of this shit show distracted, so some of us can get on with our lives. Something about the fact that the girl was cowering now, when she had dismissed Cáel so easily only a few minutes before, gave Trix a thrill. I may not be his woman, but I do care about him in my own way, and so do a surprising number of others, the woman murmured softly. So, Ndi, you can talk to him, spend time with him. Hell, I don't even care if you screw him, but don't screw with him, or you're going to wish you were back on the outside. Ndi stood in shock as Trix tugged the curl between her fingers twice and then turned for the elevator. Later, sweetheart, she called back over her shoulder. Her threat delivered, and now she was in the mood for something sweet.